There are moments in television that nobody plans for. Not the writers, not the producers, not the host who has spent decades learning how to handle anything a stage can throw at him. These moments do not arrive with music or a warning. They arrive the way real things always arrive, quietly, in the middle of something ordinary when nobody is ready. This is one of those moments. And if you're new here, welcome, hit that like button and subscribe before we go any further, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. The kind that reminds you that real life, on its best days, is stranger and more beautiful than anything anyone could write. The date was a Thursday in late February. The Family Feud studio in Atlanta was doing what it always does on a taping day: organized chaos, production assistants with clipboards, audience members filing in from the cold. The particular electricity that game show studios generate when a live crowd and bright lights and the possibility of winning money are all in the same room at the same time. Two families were backstage preparing. Steve Harvey was in hair and makeup running through notes. Nobody knew what was about to happen, including, for a few more minutes, the three people it was about to happen to. The first family to take the stage that day was a woman named Patricia Owens. She was 45 years old, a high school biology teacher from Raleigh, North Carolina. She was tall with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she kept forgetting were there and looking for. She had brought with her a team assembled from her life in Raleigh: her husband of 16 years, Jerome, a soft-spoken man who worked in municipal planning, and had the steady calm of someone who has learned to be the anchor in a room. Her best friend Renata, 43, who had known Patricia since their freshman year of college, and who laughed at a volume that suggested she had never once in her life been self-conscious about joy. Patricia's neighbor and close friend Winston, 51, a retired Army sergeant who coached youth basketball on weekends, and Patricia's teenage son, Elijah, 17, who had been told by his mother to be on his best behavior, a request he was visibly making an effort to honor. Patricia had applied to Family Feud twice before. The first time they had not heard back. The second time they had gotten to the video stage and then been passed over. The third application was the one that worked, and she had submitted it, she said, because Elijah had bet her $20 that she would give up after the second rejection. She did not give up. Elijah owed her $20 that he had not yet paid. She was funny and open and immediately comfortable on stage, the way teachers often are. People who have spent years holding a room's attention know how to be seen without performing. Steve liked her within the first 60 seconds. You could tell by the way he relaxed slightly, the almost imperceptible dropping of the professional hosting posture into something more like conversation. The opposing family was introduced. They came from the left side of the stage, and the audience turned and applauded, and the five of them took their places. Their name was Delaney. And the person at the center of the family, the one who had organized the application, who had chosen the team, who stood at the front with her arms slightly out at her sides like she was steadying herself on a boat, was a woman named Sandra Delaney Brooks. She was 45 years old. She lived in Charleston, South Carolina. She was a nurse practitioner who specialized in pediatric care. She had warm brown skin and natural hair, and a way of standing that suggested she had learned to take up space on purpose, the way people do when they have spent years of their life learning they are allowed to. Steve went through the introductions with the Delaney family. Sandra's husband, a man named Cliff who worked in commercial real estate and had the easy smile of someone comfortable in social situations. Sandra's sister-in-law, a woman named Toya, who was Cliff's younger sister and had already decided she was going to win this. Sandra's co-worker and close friend Marjorie, 48, who had taken the day off work specifically for this and told anyone who asked that she would take another one if she had to. And Sandra's mother, a 71-year-old woman named Ruth, white-haired and elegant, who sat in the family section of the audience and watched everything with the particular expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of life and learned to receive it with grace. The game began. It was a good game. Both families were engaged, both were funny in different ways, and Steve moved through it with his usual combination of warmth and speed, pulling laughter from every corner of the room. Patricia gave an answer about things you find at a birthday party that made Steve stop and ask her to repeat it twice, because he wanted to make sure he had heard correctly. Sandra turned out to have a competitive streak that she had been quietly housing behind her nurse practitioner composure, and it emerged in the second round with an intensity that delighted the audience and mildly alarmed her husband, Cliff. It was, in other words, a perfectly good episode of Family Feud. Entertaining, warm, fast-moving. The kind of episode that makes people feel good on a Thursday night. And then the game paused in the way game shows sometimes do, a natural break between rounds, the kind where the host checks in with both families, loosens the room, maybe gets a laugh or two before moving forward. Steve walked over to Sandra's side of the stage. He was doing his usual routine, asking casual questions, letting the audience get to know the family a little better. He asked Sandra about her job, about what it was like being a pediatric nurse practitioner, about whether she had any stories she could share on daytime television. Sandra laughed and started talking about her work. And then Steve asked the question he often asks in these moments, not because it is strategic, but because he is genuinely curious about people, and it shows. He said, "Tell me about your family. Where are you from originally? How did you end up in Charleston?" Sandra said she had grown up in Columbia, South Carolina. She said she had been adopted as an infant by a couple named Harold and Ruth Delaney. She gestured toward her mother sitting in the audience, and Ruth raised one hand in a small, dignified wave. She said she had known she was adopted from a very young age, that her parents had always been honest with her about it, that she had a wonderful childhood and never spent much time thinking about what she didn't know about her origins. Then she said something that she later described as a thing she mentioned almost reflexively, the way people mention facts about themselves that they have carried for so long they forget other people don't know them. She said, "I was a triplet. My biological mother had triplets and we were all separated at birth and adopted into different families. I've never met the other two." Steve Harvey stopped, not the brief pause of a host choosing his next line, a full stop. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite readable, not yet, because he was processing something, and the processing was visible. He said slowly, "Say that again for me." Sandra repeated it, slightly puzzled by his reaction. She said she was a triplet. She said the other two had been adopted by other families. She said she had tried to find them once, years ago, through an adoption registry, but hadn't made a match. She said she had made peace with not knowing. Steve turned toward the other side of the stage. He looked at Patricia Owens. He said, "Patricia." Patricia looked up. He said, "Where were you born?" Patricia said, "Columbia, South Carolina." Her voice was already different, not alarmed, something else, like a person who has just heard a sound they recognize but cannot immediately name. Steve said, "Were you adopted?" The studio went very, very quiet. Patricia said yes. Her voice was barely above a conversational volume, but the microphone caught every word with perfect clarity. Steve said, "At birth." She said yes. He said, "Patricia, were you a triplet?" And Patricia Owens, 45 years old, high school biology teacher from Raleigh, North Carolina, standing under bright studio lights in front of a live audience of 200 people, and cameras broadcasting to millions more, looked across the stage at a woman she had never seen before in her life and said, very quietly, "Yes." What happened next is difficult to describe with full accuracy because multiple things occurred simultaneously, and the cameras, good as they were, could only capture so much of it at once. Sandra Delaney Brooks turned her whole body toward Patricia. Her hands came up to her face. Ruth, in the audience, stood up from her seat. Steve Harvey took one step back and then stood completely still. The audience did not make a sound. Elijah, Patricia's 17-year-old son, looked between his mother and the woman across the stage with an expression of total incomprehension slowly becoming total comprehension. And Patricia walked across the stage. She did not run. She walked, the way people move when their legs are working, but the rest of them is somewhere else entirely, somewhere inside the moment, trying to catch up to what is real. Sandra met her halfway. They stood in front of each other for 1 second, just one, and in that second, two women who had been born together, who had spent 45 years on the same planet in the same state without ever being in the same room, looked at each other's faces and found themselves looking at something that was both a stranger and, in some cellular, irreducible way, deeply familiar. Then they held each other. The audience came apart, not in the sharp burst of a game show win. In something longer and less organized, a wave of sound that included crying and clapping, and a few people saying things that weren't words at all, just sounds, because sometimes a moment exceeds the capacity of language, and the body has to express it some other way. Steve Harvey did not try to hold it together. He had made a decision somewhere in the last 60 seconds that this was not a moment for hosting. This was a moment for being a human being in a room where a human thing was happening, and those are different jobs, and he knew which one was called for. He cried, not quietly, not with any particular attempt at composure. His shoulders shook slightly, and he turned his head away for a moment and then turned back because he didn't want to miss it. Later he said that turning away was a reflex and that he immediately regretted it. He said, "You don't turn away from something like that, even when it breaks you open, especially then." Jerome, Patricia's husband, had both hands pressed flat over his mouth. Renata was making a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob and had apparently decided to simply let it be both. Winston, the retired army sergeant who had been measured and still all morning, had tears running down his face and was making no effort to stop them, which Jerome later said was the most shocking thing he had seen all day. Cliff, Sandra's husband, stood very still with his hand on his chest. Toya had her arm around Marjorie and they were both crying. Ruth, Sandra's mother, had made her way from the audience seating to the edge of the stage, assisted by a production assistant, and stood there watching her daughter hold a woman she had never met, a woman who was, in the most foundational biological sense, her daughter's other self. Ruth later said in a soft and careful voice that she had known Sandra was a triplet. That Harold, her late husband, had known too, that they had told Sandra when she was young and answered every question she asked honestly, but that over the years the questions had come less often and they had followed Sandra's lead. She said, "We always thought if she wanted to find them, she would find them. We didn't know how to help and we didn't want to push. I think about that sometimes, whether we should have done more." She paused. "But then I see today and I think, maybe this was the way it was supposed to happen. I can't explain that, I just feel it." Nobody challenged her on it. Some things don't need to be explained. Steve Harvey, when he was able to speak, stood in the center of the stage and looked at the two women and looked at the audience and took a breath that the microphone caught clearly. The long, steadying breath of a man collecting himself, because what comes next needs words and the words need him to be upright. He said, "I have been doing this show for a long time. I have stood on this stage for a long time, and I want you to hear me when I tell you that I have never, not once, experienced anything like what just happened." He stopped. He said, "Two women walked onto this stage today as strangers, 45 years apart, 45 years not knowing, and somehow, they ended up on opposite sides of this stage in this building on this day." He shook his head slowly. He said, "I don't have an explanation for that. I'm not going to try to give you one. Some things don't need an explanation. Some things just need to be witnessed." The audience gave him a long, rolling wave of applause. He waited for it to settle. Then he said, "But I have to ask." He looked at Patricia and Sandra, who were still standing close together, shoulders touching, hands loosely held. "You said there were 3 of you." The room went still again. Patricia and Sandra looked at each other. Sandra said quietly, "Yes, there were 3. Steve said, "Do either of you know anything about the third?" Patricia shook her head slowly. Sandra did the same. Steve looked at the camera. He said, "Then we've got some work to do." What happened in the following 3 weeks was not broadcast live, and it was not simple, and it is important to tell it accurately because the truth of it matters more than the convenience of a clean story. The show's production team, working with a private adoption search specialist they had used before for family reunion segments, began the search for the third triplet. The biological records were nearly 50 years old. The adoption had been handled through a private agency in South Carolina that had since closed. The paper trail was incomplete in the way paper trails from that era often are, particularly for black families navigating private adoption systems in the American South in the late 1970s, where documentation was inconsistent and the interests of adoptees and biological siblings were not always prioritized. It took 19 days. The third triplet's name was Veronica James. She was 45 years old. She lived in Birmingham, Alabama, where she worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm that handled clients in the construction industry. She had been adopted by a couple named James, both now deceased, who had raised her in a quiet neighborhood in East Birmingham and told her, as the Delaney's had told Sandra, that she was adopted, and that she had been born in Columbia, South Carolina, and that there was more of her story out there if she ever wanted to look for it. Veronica had looked once. She was 30, working her first real accounting job, newly married, and she had sent her DNA to one of the consumer ancestry databases that were becoming popular at the time. She had gotten back results that suggested she had a sibling. The confidence level was listed as very high, but the other profile on the database had a privacy setting that blocked direct contact, and the indirect messages she sent through the platform had never been answered. She had closed the browser window and gone back to her life, not because she had stopped caring, because hope that goes unanswered long enough starts to feel like a risk you can't keep taking. She was at her desk on a Tuesday morning when she got the call from the show's researcher. She later said she thought it was a scam. She said she was polite but clipped and asked 3 times how they had gotten her number. She said the researcher was patient and clear and eventually said the words that changed everything. She said, "We found your sisters." Veronica James was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the researcher asked if she was still on the line. She said she was. She said she needed a minute. She took the minute. Then she said, "Tell me everything." The reunion episode aired 5 weeks after the original game. It opened with footage from that first Thursday, the game, the conversation, the pause, the walk across the stage. Then it cut to the studio, reconfigured slightly. No game podiums. No scoreboards, 3 chairs center stage. Steve Harvey standing to the side. Patricia Owens came out first. The audience, which had been told in general terms what was happening but not the specifics, applauded warmly. Sandra Delaney Brooks came out second. They embraced before sitting down, the ease of it already different from that first moment 5 weeks ago, not less moving but more settled, the way things are when they have had a little time to become real. And then Steve said, "There's one more person I'd like to bring out." And Veronica James walked onto the Family Feud stage for the first time. She was wearing a deep burgundy blazer. Her hair was natural, pulled back. She walked steadily, the way a person walks when they have made a decision about how they are going to carry themselves through something enormous, and then she looked at the 2 women sitting in the chairs, and for a moment she simply stopped walking and looked at them. Patricia and Sandra stood up. 3 women, 45 years old, born on the same day in a hospital in Columbia, South Carolina, who had grown up in 3 different cities, in 3 different families, with 3 different names and 3 different lives and 3 different versions of the same origin story, stood in the same room and looked at each other's faces. Veronica put her hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Then Patricia opened her arms and Veronica walked into them, and Sandra put her arms around both of them, and the 3 of them stood in the center of a game show stage, holding each other for a long time, while the audience made the sounds that people make when they are in the presence of something they cannot fully process, and so they simply feel it. Steve Harvey did not even attempt composure. He stood off to the side with his hand over his eyes and made no pretense about it. A crew member off camera was also crying. The floor director was crying. The woman who worked the teleprompter was crying. The 3 stagehands who had set up the chairs that morning and thought they were just setting up chairs were crying. When the 3 women finally separated and sat down, Steve pulled up a chair of his own and sat with them, not as a host, as a person. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "Tell me what this feels like, not for television." "Just tell me the truth." Patricia spoke first. She said, "I've had a good life, I want to say that clearly. My parents were wonderful, my husband is wonderful, my son is sitting out there and he's the best thing I've ever done. I don't want anything I say today to suggest my life was missing something, because it wasn't." She paused. "But there has always been a question, just a quiet question in the back of everything. Who else is there?" And today the question got answered. "And it turns out the answer looks like me." Her voice broke at the end of that sentence. "It looks exactly like me," Sandra said. "I'm a nurse. I have spent my whole career understanding the body, how it works, what it needs, how it heals, and I thought I understood a lot about human beings." She smiled at Veronica and then at Patricia. "I don't think I understood this. I don't think there's a clinical explanation for what it feels like to look at someone and just know. Before you know anything about them, just know." Veronica was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She said, "I gave up. I want to be honest about that. I tried once and I gave up, and I've spent 15 years thinking that maybe it was better that way, that maybe some things are better left as they are." She looked at her sisters. "I was wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong. I'm so glad." Steve Harvey nodded slowly. He said, "What do you want to know about each other? Where do you start?" And then something happened that none of the producers had scripted and nobody had anticipated, and that turned out to be the most shared moment of the entire episode. The 3 women looked at each other, and then they all started talking at exactly the same time, all 3 of them, the same impulse, the same instinct, and then all 3 of them stopped at exactly the same time, and then all 3 of them burst out laughing. The same laugh, the same timing, the same note. Steve Harvey lost it completely. He put his face in both hands and his whole body shook. The audience was laughing and crying simultaneously, a combination of sounds that is genuinely rare in any setting, and that those present said they had never quite heard before and didn't expect to hear again. Veronica, recovering first, said between laughs, "We haven't spoken a word to each other in 45 years, and we already talk over each other." Sandra said, still laughing, "We were probably doing that in the womb." Patricia looked at the ceiling and said, "Lord, what did I do to deserve 2 more of myself?" That moment, the simultaneous talking, the simultaneous stopping, the simultaneous laughter, was the clip that moved fastest and furthest. Not the initial reunion, though that was what made people cry. This was what made people feel joy, because it was the proof, visible in real time, that some things survive every separation. Some things are so deeply written into a person that 45 years of different lives and different cities and different names cannot change them. The timing of a laugh, the instinct to speak, the particular music of who you are at the most fundamental level. A geneticist who was interviewed by a science publication a week after the episode aired said that what the audience had witnessed was consistent with research on identical multiples raised apart. That certain traits, including speech timing, vocal patterns, and reactive humor, show extraordinarily high concordance even in the absence of shared environment. She said the science was clear, but that the emotional reality of watching it happen in real time was, in her words, something the science could describe but not prepare you for. Most people who watched the clip did not know the science. They did not need to. They watched three women laugh in unison 45 years after they were last in the same room, and they felt something that was true before it was explained. The three sisters spent the weekend together in Atlanta after the taping. They stayed in adjacent rooms at a hotel near the studio and ordered room service and talked until 4 in the morning on the first night, and then couldn't believe they had talked until 4 in the morning, and then did it again the second night. They compared their hands, identical span, different calluses. They compared their voices on a recording app that Veronica had on her phone, nearly indistinguishable to the ear, though each of them swore she could tell the difference. They found that all three of them were allergic to the same antibiotic, that all three of them had played an instrument in middle school and stopped in high school for reasons none of them could fully explain, that all three of them made tea the same way, strong, with no sugar, with a specific amount of time for steeping that they had each arrived at independently, and that was, to within 30 seconds, identical. Patricia called her mother on the second night, her adoptive mother, a 78-year-old woman in Raleigh who was following all of this on the television and had been crying on and off for 2 days. Patricia told her she loved her. Her mother said, "I know, baby, I know. How are they?" And Patricia said, "Mom, they're wonderful." And her mother said, "Of course they are. You're wonderful." Sandra called Ruth, who was also following along and had been. Ruth asked carefully and lovingly how it was going, and Sandra said it was more than she had expected. Ruth said, "That's how it should be." She paused. "Your father would have been so happy." Sandra said, "I know." She said, "Thank you for always telling me the truth about where I came from. It made it easier to find my way back to it." Ruth was quiet for a moment and said, "We just followed your lead, my love. We always followed your lead." Veronica called nobody that night. She sat on the small hotel balcony by herself for a while, drinking tea the way she always made it, and looked at the city and thought about the 15 years she had spent not looking. She thought about the database message that had gone unanswered. She thought about closing the browser window. She thought about what she would say to her younger self if she could. She decided she would say, "Be patient. It finds its way. It always finds its way." She thought about her parents, both gone now, who had kept her origin story available to her for her whole life even when she wasn't ready to use it. She felt something toward them that she could not have named before that week. Something that was gratitude and sorrow and love all at once, the way feelings get when the people you want to share a moment with are not there to share it. She went back inside, knocked on Patricia's door, said she couldn't sleep. Patricia opened the door wide without hesitation, the way people do when the door was already open anyway. Veronica came in. Sandra, who had apparently also been awake, appeared at the connecting door 30 seconds later. They ordered more tea. They talked until 6 in the morning. In the months that followed the episode, the three sisters built what Patricia described in a later interview as a slow, careful, real thing, not the fairy tale version. Not the movie version where everyone is instantly everything to each other, and the 45 years collapse overnight. The real version, which involves phone calls and visits and learning how another person takes up space, and working out the differences alongside the similarities and choosing, repeatedly, to keep showing up. They took a trip together 6 months after the taping. A long weekend in Savannah. None of them had chosen it for any particular reason. They just all liked it when someone suggested it, which they later realized said something about them. They walked along the waterfront. They ate at a restaurant where the server looked between the three of them with undisguised curiosity and finally said, "Are you three sisters?" And they said yes without even exchanging a glance first, because by then it was the simplest possible truth. Sandra put together a folder of what information she had been able to gather about their biological mother. A woman named Cora, who had been 22 when she had 3 babies she was not able to keep, who had placed all 3 with an adoption agency within days of their birth, who had died in 1998, which meant she was not alive to know what happened on a February Thursday in an Atlanta television studio. The folder was thin, a name, a few facts, a photograph that Sandra had found through a genealogy researcher, a young woman looking at the camera with an expression they could not read. They passed the photograph between them without saying much. Then Veronica said quietly she was young. Patricia said she was. Sandra said she did the best she could. It was not a verdict. It was not a resolution. It was just a thing that was probably true about a person they would never meet, and they held it as gently as they could. Steve Harvey closed the reunion episode with words that did not require any particular effort because the truth of the moment had done all the work already. He stood center stage with the three women beside him, and he said, "I have been saying for years that Family Feud is about families. That's the whole point. Bring families together, let people see each other, let the good stuff happen." He looked at Patricia, Sandra, and Veronica. "I did not know when I went to work on a Thursday in February that I was about to be in the room when a family found itself. I didn't plan that. Nobody planned that," he smiled. "But I'll tell you something. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful that I was there." He turned to the camera. "Some things you can't manufacture, some things you can't write. They just happen, and you just have to be humble enough to get out of the way and let them." The three sisters stood together on the stage where they had found each other. Three women, 45 years old, born on the same cold morning in a Columbia hospital, who had grown up as only children and strangers and who would spend the rest of their lives as something they had each quietly longed for without fully letting themselves say it. Sisters, real ones, found ones. Chosen every day going forward the same way the best things always are. If this story moved you, share it with someone. A friend who needed something real today, a family member who has been thinking about someone they've lost touch with, anyone who needed to be reminded that it is not too late. It is never too late. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time with another story worth telling.